Okay guys, do you know what to do whenever you get a mobile pawn center? Do you know the typical plans, typical ideas? Well, if you do, let me know in the comments. If you don't, well, that's exactly what this lesson is going to be about. If you already went over lesson 138 where we learned how to properly evaluate a position, come up with a plan, well, it's time to continue to get familiarized with the different pawn center. Before we get into it guys, if you're familiar with it or not, feel free to give it a try, okay? Pause the video and try to evaluate this position. If I'm the black pieces, it's my turn. What should I be doing? Think of the next move, of course, look at candidate moves, but more importantly, think of the long-term plan. And while you're at it, take a look at the other two positions that we're going to be working on today. This first one was played by the great Alexander Alekhine. The second one was played by Alexander Kotov. If you're not familiar with this player, guys, very strong grandmaster and very good author. He has different books. I remember there's one titled Train Like a Grandmaster. And then finally, what I wanted to do, guys, to wrap up, to make sure that we actually got these ideas, is to go over to this exercise from chess.com where they show you this position, right? And they want you to continue. And as you can see, they also have a mobile pawn center. Guys, mobile pawn center means flexibility. So these are pawns that are, in this case, we have the classical pawn center, right? Pawn on e4, pawn on d4, and these pawns are free to advance. So we have to time it right. We have to know when to advance. And more importantly, we need to know what to do once we advance one of those pawns. Now, before we get into it, and I wanted to start with this game actually, just know guys, this is lesson number 140 and we have been learning about pawn centers for a long time now. If you remember when we learned about the Peter's defense, King's Indian defense, we learned a lot about the closed center. And we know that when the center is locked, we're supposed to take a look at the pawn structure, which is going to tell us where to attack. If it's aiming at the king side, we attack on the king side. And in this position, for the white pieces, it is aiming at the queen side. So that's where they should be expanding and attacking. And of course, we also talked about how we should be targeting the pawn in front of our most forward pawn. If you have no idea what I just said, go to lesson number 91 and many others that we have on middle game strategy. Now, with that said, let me go all the way to the beginning, guys, because this is a critical moment, but I want you to see how they got here, okay? So this position started with d4, and I need you to pay attention to the center. I'm gonna go really quickly through it, not analyzing the moves or anything. Nimzo Indian defense, we've talked about it a lot. And look at the center. Look, so far we are in charge of the center, and then the black pieces claim the center with d5. And then a3, they take. Notice that we don't really mind these pawns. We're gonna take at some point. And then you look at this tension that we have in the center. Guys, this is critical. Whatever we do here in the center with these pawns is going to dictate the remaining of the middle game, or strategies, or plans, and so on. So we have to be very careful. From here, we could end up with isolated pawns, hanging pawns, and we need to know what to do in those cases. So after pawn takes, bishop d3, 92, and by the way guys, 92, this is the difference between us and grandmasters. So in this position, the moment he did 92, he already had pictured the position that I'm going to show you in a moment, the critical position. He did this move because he knew he wanted to get a mobile pawn center. If he had gone to knight f3, he couldn't do what you're going to see next. He wants to do f3, pawn e4, and get that classical center with the pawn on e4 and d4. So after b6, castle, bishop a6, getting rid of our powerful bishop. But now notice how this knight gets a little bit out of the game on the edge, right? So f3, knight b8, queen d3, rook e8, and then we got knight to g3. Guys, this knight, of course, it could help us by getting to the king side and attack, but more importantly, we want to make this work. So after knight c6, we got full development now after bishop b2, rook c8, and the final move to prepare our pawn e4 advance. And by the way, this is something that whenever I have a chance, I mention it. The only piece that is doing nothing is going to come over to help us, rook e1. And now we could say that all of our pieces are fully developed. Okay, so after rook a to e1, we got h6, and then pawn to e4. Pawn takes, pawn takes, pawn takes, pawn takes, and we got our classic center, which is also a mobile pawn center. Now, if you had done something like this, of course you wouldn't do it. Notice how it changes completely. Now we have an isolated pawn. The middle game plans for both sides are different. So anyhow, pawn takes, And after knight e5, very nice move, and this is so cool, so sophisticated, but it's just not going to do anything. Long term, what's going to prevail is the mobile pawn center. So queen goes back to d1, knight c4, and bishop c1. Let me use this opportunity to talk about this pattern. Remember, the bishop 2 squares away from the knight, which means we're controlling that knight, okay? Now, after knight h7, we get to the critical position, guys. And this is where I wanted you to pause the video and tell me what you do next. At least think about it, and then you compare to what they actually did in the game. Well, believe it or not, guys, if you have been following the lessons from this channel, you should know exactly what to do here next. And there's a reason why we're talking about this now on lesson 140. And the reason is that we already talked about a very important pattern that they used in this game, the other game that I'm going to show you from Alekhine, and finally the one in the exercise from chess.com. Well, the move is actually pawn to e5. And I know a lot of you are going to be like, oh, I have never done that, because you have said so many times that you don't want to advance this strong center unless you're being challenged by a pawn, right? And then you do e5. Well, I know that we don't like the weak square in front of the pawn, but there is something to it. This is the bad part, but the good part is that we get more space in the king side, guys, and that's the whole point about that. I mentioned it before. You look at the pawn structure, it's aiming at the king side. We have more space. We should be expanding there, and this is something that you're going to see in the 3 games. If we go quickly here to the other game, in this position, you're going to see that once we have the strong mobile center, we're going to find the right way to advance it. But look at the move, pawn to e4 again. Why? It gives me more space on the king side. This knight that is defending has to move now away. And by the way, this is, guys, straight out of lesson number 78, King's Indian attack. So we saw Bobby Fischer using this pawn structure to attack. And we also had a lesson on the Greek gift. And we talked in the Greek gift how we need the pawn on e4 or e5 to kick that knight out and give us more space, the bishop aiming at h2, the knight ready to go to g4 and the queen. So this is something that you should know if you have been following this course. Guys, if you're weak when it comes to tactics, you shouldn't be here on lesson 140. Anyways, let me go back to the other game. Sorry that I'm back and forth, but it is important. And let me just show you, I'm not going to show you the entire game for the other 2, but for this one, I wanted you to see how they went from opening to middle game. Once they got to the middle game, they decided to go for this plan and attack the king. So e5, rook e6, and now of course we have to be consistent. We have to follow through with our plan. So rook e4, we're more than familiar with the rook lift, rook rollover to attack the king. We don't have an open file here on the g file, so we're going to put the rook in front of the pawns. Now knight f8, and of course our pieces are all going to start getting closer to that king. Knight f5, then we got king h8, and then of course time for our queen to get into the game. And now it's very interesting because this rook not only is ready to roll over to the king side or to attack the king, but it is also defending the pawn along with the knight. So now our queen, guys, candidate moves, queen g4, queen h5. Of course, we're going to go all the way to h5. So now we have rook d7. Notice how if we look at if we split the board in half, on the king side, guys, the white pieces have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 pieces. This bishop is on the queen side, but bishops attack from far away, right? Now, the black pieces, they only have 2 defenders. So this is looking good. It's looking like one of those puzzles where we have so many pieces ready to do the combination. So anyhow, after rook c7, I'm thinking trying to help through the 7th rank. We got rook h4. And then, guys, what would you do after knight h7? Again, if your tactics are weak, you shouldn't be here. You should be hitting the tactics gym. But anyhow, white pieces to move. I trust that you pause the video and try to find the best continuation. Now, I'm going to tell you the moves before we do it on the board. Let's try to do it in our head first. That way we practice visualization. Guys, do this. If you're doing tactics at home, before you move the pieces on the board, do it in your head, okay? So anyhow, the move here is knight to g7, just exposing that king, and then that way we can follow through with all of our pieces. So after knight g7, king takes on g7, our bishop comes to h6, defended by this battery, and at that point, then the king goes back to g8. Now, after the king goes to g8, remember the rook that was on the 4th rank, rook lift? Well, now we go rook g4 check, And after rook g6, there's a very powerful move. Now, I'm not gonna make you suffer because I'm pretty sure you guys, it's getting a little bit blurry for you. So let's do it on the board. But after they take, we got check on h6, king goes back to g8. And by the way, you might be thinking, why did the king go stay on the open file? Why didn't the king go to h8? Well, if the king goes to h8, you have the very powerful move. And again, let's do it, let's do it in our head. Bishop g7, check, threatening to do checkmate. They take on h7, the king has to go, then queen h8 check, king e7. And now, what is the only piece defending the queen? Well, it's going to be the king, so we're going to do a deflection with rook f7, king takes, and we collect that queen. So this is what we're looking at. Of course, check. They have to go here, check. Everything is forcing. So at this point, deflect the queen, and then, the king, and then we get that queen. Guys, this should be very easy for you to finish. Not only do we have more material, but that king is still in trouble. Anyhow, let me go all the way back. And in this game, they went king g8. And then after rook g4, we got rook g6. Now here, if you found the other moves, if you found knight g7, if you found the reason why they didn't go to h8, then your tactics are on point. However, there's a very powerful move here now for the white pieces. We gotta finish this. And I know that most of you thought of just doing rook takes, pawn takes, queen takes. Well, this is the difference between us and grandmasters, guys. They see a good move, and like Emmanuel Lasker used to say, when you see a good move, you look for a better one. And in this case, the better move is pawn to e6. Very powerful. They cannot take us. It's going to be check, checkmate. And now this pawn, if we deflect it, is the one defending the rook. So after pawn to e6, the black pieces simply resign. So guys, again, I just wanted to show you this game for you to see how we went from opening to middle game. Once we got the mobile central pawn, we need to decide what to do. And now you can see how this idea of e5, just to gain more space on the king side, makes perfect sense if you're ready to attack afterwards. Now, like I said, I'm not going to show you the other two games completely, but let's take a look here at this one. So if I go back, after e4, the knight moves. Notice how quickly we start bringing pieces to the king side. It doesn't make sense for us to just do e4 and then start doing c4 and moving the pieces to the queen side. If you decided to do this, you need to be consistent and work on the king side, because now you have more space. Notice that if I'm white, if I do this, I'm sorry about doing this, I know it's confusing, but if I'm white now, I know they're coming to attack me on the king side. But again, if you split the board in half, most of my pieces are on the queen side, and it's so uncomfortable, so difficult to bring them over to the king side. Why? Because of this pawn on e4. It's just not letting me. If we remove this pawn, quickly I could do knight f3, for example. Okay, so just something for you to keep in mind. Let me turn it around again. And after knight e5, knight d1, look, knight g4, quickly we're going to attack using this momentum. So take, knight f1, queen g5. And again, guys, I'm not going to go move by move because I'm leaving the link to this game so you could review them at home, but also because this lesson is about middle game strategy, not tactics. So we're gonna go knight f5, d4, d3. Now this is already a protected pass pawn. We know this is, even in the end game, is going to be a huge liability for my opponent, right? So let me just go quickly to show you. You already see, look, the queen keeps going away from the king side, check. Then we continue to prepare the attack. And then after knight e2, knight g3, we have pawn to d2. The rook has nowhere to go, and notice how they waited for the right moment to do d2. This, you want to hold it for as long as you can. If you let go of the pawn to leave it weak, is for a good reason, right? Now, let me just show you a few more moves here. There is actually, guys, a very nice sacrifice, which is bishop h3. Like, again, we have all of our pieces ready for it. But the question to you is, what's the follow-up? What's the move after the pawn takes? Well, again, our rook goes up trying to deliver checkmate. After knight g3, h4, bishop f6, rook h3, and this is it, guys. I know even in this position that it looks so nice for the black pieces, this is completely winning. I know that we could still make mistakes. So let me ask you this before we move on to the exercise on chess.com. What would you do if the king goes to g2? What would you do if the king goes to g1? Well, if the king goes to g2, we have check. The king has to go down and then checkmate, right? So we're looking at this. And if the king goes instead to g1, this is the one that I think a lot of you guys missed. If the king goes to g1, well, it's on the dark square, perfect for a discover attack on the queen. So check, and then we collect that queen on b6. All right, guys, with that said, you saw, again, before we move on, notice how from the moment they got to that middle game position with a mobile pawn center, they used the opportunity to do e4, gain more space on the king side, and then they continued to attack. All of their pieces quickly went to the king side. All right, now let's go to chess.com. Sorry about this part over here. Guys, this is an exercise that, I mean, if you want, you could just go to chess.com and do it on your own before you see it here. But you already know what this is about. We want to do something with our mobile pawn center, and most likely it has to do with e5. Now, even with those two examples, even with all of this talk, I know that 70% of you are going to choose the wrong move here. And that's simply because you skipped lesson 111, 112. Well, anyways, I'm pretty sure that a lot of you guys rushed into bishop takes f6, bishop takes, and then pawn e5, right? Well, truth is that this bishop is very powerful here, guys. And if we just take on f6, we are giving it up and we're leaving them with the pair of bishops, right? And actually, I'm gonna do it on purpose here by mistake. This is not the move. But if I did it, notice how they tell you bishop f6 is incorrect, because you can keep the two knights, but in turn, you're leaving your opponent with the pair of bishops, right? So the move instead is to do e5 right away, make the knight leave, and actually let me go next. And now that you can take the bishop, notice how automatically this square on d6 becomes weak. This is straight out of lesson number 52. That's one of the most important lessons in this course, guys. Before, if I go back, this square cannot be defended by pawns, they're advanced, but the bishop is still on the board. The moment we eliminate the bishop, then that's going to be 8. Now, my knight, again, look at my mobile pawn center. It's not so mobile anymore. It's not so flexible, but now my strategy is in place. Knight e4, just trying to get to the king side, but also in this case, I want to get to d6. Okay, guys, I'm going to leave it here. I'm leaving the link to the two games that we analyzed in the description. And like always, don't forget, if you just landed on this video, to go back to prior lessons, guys. There's a reason why I put the lessons in order. So just know that you can access them anytime. And with that said, don't forget to like and subscribe. And I will see you on our live stream next Thursday. And also lesson 141 coming next week.